Hi, and welcome to another episode, our first of the semester, of Choose Your Issues, the podcast from the Objectivism program at the Salem Center here at the University of Texas, Austin. I'm Greg Salmieri. I work in the center and teach philosophy here at the University of Texas. Joining me as often is Ben Bayer from the Ayn Rand Institute. A few episodes back, last semester, we talked about a conference on academic freedom that was held at Stanford University that I attended, was co-sponsored by the center. And I was critical of the kind of concept of academic freedom and how it's framed, but we also discussed how there are real issues that people are concerned about, that are real problems that are often put in these terms, and why we think they're the wrong terms to put them in. And one of these controversies, where I think something really bad was done, and seems the world agrees, has really come to light recently. So I thought it would be a good thing to spend this episode talking about one of these cases and thinking it through. And Ben, I know you've really been reading up on it. So do you want to start us off with a summary of what happened?
Yeah, and it seems like a good kind of topic to discuss since it's the beginning of the semester again. UT campus is open again, students everywhere, young minds coming to learn new things about the universe around them, and yet what we see happening increasingly is a real reluctance to expose people to ideas that they find uncomfortable. And this happened most recently at
It looks like our video cut off.
yeah.
Have you?
Is
It's
the
back.
audio
Okay.
still going?
It's back. Or he's seeing it before we do. So
All right. It happened at Hamlin University, which is a small liberal arts college in St. Paul, Minnesota. There was an art history class being taught. It was actually last semester and all the way back in October. So this happened like mid-semester by a professor who's an adjunct professor, Erica Lopez Prater, art history professor. And she's teaching, I can't remember if it was a course on art history generally or on art history of the Middle East,
I
but
thought it was general, but
may
I
well
don't
have
think it
been.
matters for the.
And she wanted to expose her students to a variety of art forms from a variety of cultures. And so she decided to include Islamic art and told her students up front that I'm going to show depictions of various religious figures, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, and if any of you, for whatever reason, have objections or have sensitivities about these kinds of things, let me know in advance. We'll work something out. You don't have to come and see it. This is the beginning of the semester on the syllabus. She repeats the same message, I think, at the beginning of the lecture in question in October, and shows a 14th century Persian painting of Muhammad and an angel. This is nothing like a Charlie Hebdo cartoon, which is satirical, mocking Muhammad. She is trying very hard to present it respectfully, but chaos ensues. And
more to the point of her presenting it respectfully, it's a painting by a Muslim which is not worshipful of Muhammad, because part of the point of the prohibition on images that you're not meant to worship him. But anyway, that's reverent, presenting him as an inspired figure, is a positive portrayal of him. Now, how relevant that is to all of this, I think, is something we should discuss later. But it is a factor that a lot of people have been focused on.
Yeah, and the reason chaos ensues is because there's a substantial number of Muslims, not all Muslims, but a substantial number of the more conservative sects who think that any pictographical portrayal of not just Muhammad, but any religious prophet or deity is verboten, is haram in this case. And so several Muslim students are in the class, raised protests, even though they could have done so previously before the whole thing happened, when she asked them to, which is interesting. And then subsequently write letters to, or write, and they must have written letters to the administration or something, because it gets written up as an op-ed in the student newspaper, objecting to this, objecting to being mistreated, objecting to it as Islamophobic is the term they use. And the professor, because she's an adjuncts are renewed from semester to semester, as we know, is not renewed. And now there's dispute as, does this mean she's fired? Does this mean she's let go?
But
the most neutral thing is she's not renewed.
But in particular, a particular class she was scheduled to teach for this spring, I think, got taken off the schedule. So it's not just who knew whether they were going to hire her again. They withdrew a class she was meant to teach, seemingly for this reason. But we don't have the university's take on that exactly.
We know that it was for this reason. That it was the administrators of the university say that it was a department level decision, and the process that started once the students started making objections with their Office of Diversity or whatever. There's a document I read earlier today saying we concluded as a result of this process concerning this controversy that it would be better if the teacher was no longer a member of the Hamlin community. And so that happened. The news about this really came out in December because the professor was still allowed to finish the semester. The news came out mid-December. Various people who see themselves as defenders of academic freedom started speaking up on behalf of it. I think I first heard about it in late December because I read a pretty decent article by a professor at Carleton College in Minnesota, Amna Khalid, who her argument was I disapprove of Hamlin's decision on several levels. As an art historian, I disapprove of it because of how students need to be exposed to primary sources if they're going to understand art history. And as a college professor, I disapprove of it because students need to be challenged. They can't just be made to feel comfortable and coddled even when they have a religious objections to something. And as a Muslim, I object to it because this is a case of a university catering to one particular interpretation of Islam that I don't happen to share, she says, and that not all Muslims do share. So that's where I think I first heard about the story. And then by the time we got to January 8th, it was in the New York Times. And since then, there's been a lot of back and forth, a lot of commentary. The local chapter of the Council of American Islamic Relations in Minneapolis area weighed into this controversy and took the side of the students against the professor. They were involved in an event at the campus having a discussion about this that was concurrent with the university's decision about it. Subsequent to that, after a lot of the controversy, after a lot of the commentary, and notably a lot of people in what you might ordinarily describe as the liberal media came to the defense of the professor. So did a lot of people in the academic establishment. And interestingly, just now a few days ago, the national office of the Council for American Islamic Relations, and we should talk about this later, came out with a statement saying, we don't think this was actually Islamophobic. And Hamlin has started to walk back their stance a bit, though not entirely because of that. I think that brings us up to date on the overall situation.
I mean, it is striking how it's hard to find people, prominent people defending Hamlin's line, right?
Yeah.
And there's pretty, in this case, there's been, that this was a bridge too far, that a mistake was made, that the professor shouldn't have been fired, has generally been the consensus of almost everything I found on this.
And this is what I saw the Times article itself, which is not an opinion piece, it's just a news article, but you can tell it's slanted, I think, in favor of the professor. And I also read pieces in Slate and The Atlantic, which are kind of left of center pieces, all of them in defense of the professor against the students.
This kind of thing is interesting for just gauging where the culture is at on these issues, because people tend to think of things as, monolithic. The right thinks this, the left thinks that, and so forth. And, but here's a case where you're finding voices pretty widely across the political spectrum agreeing that this was a kind of an excess of what exactly, and what was wrong with it. I think there probably are some differences, in that opinion.
But it's interesting to think about the
But it was an
logic
injustice.
involved in the criticism, because many of the defenders in the kind of so-called liberal media would say things like, well, the professor was being very respectful and she wasn't intending it as a criticism, and if anything she was trying to decolonize the syllabus, as they say we're supposed to do, by including perspectives from different cultures and so forth, and that it would be you'd be censoring this culture if you didn't show this kind of thing in a class. But at the same time, the students, the Muslim students who objected to it, claimed that they were offended. One of them said she'd been a Muslim for her whole life, 23 years, and she'd never seen an image of the Prophet. And another one, I think, said, the university teaches us when we do the diversity training workshops that intentions don't matter, that all that matters is the results. It doesn't matter, how well-meaning she might have been. The fact that she offended us is enough. And so, you have to wonder if the full logic of the defenders of the professor claim that this is not what they meant by their advocacy of diversity and multiculturalism. But is it or not?
I mean, it also depends on which of the defenders think of themselves as advocates for those things. So, because there's again probably a variety of views here. On the issue of whether intention matters, do we have the text of what was actually taught in this seminar that the Muslim student is?
No, not
referring back
too much.
And do we have the student's name, because it might not be because it's protected.
The student who was complaining?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do have that. There was, for instance,
but I think it would be good to
student named Kimia Kausari.
Kausari. Yeah. I mean, let's refer to her as Kausari then, because it's sort of reducing her to one thing to refer to her as the Muslim student. She's the student who complained.
There's also another one, Aram Weditala.
Yeah. So, Kausari, if she was citing the what they taught her in the diversity, do we have that? Do we know what they said? Because it's.
Yeah, I have it right here.
It seems to me quite a different thing to say if someone does something offensive, that they did the thing offensive is what matters and not their intention, than to say if someone offended you, that they offended you and not their intention is what mattered. Like
the line that I had in mind was not from either of those students. D'Angela Huddleston, a Hamlin senior and MSA member, MSA is Muslim Students Alliance or Association, also shared her thoughts with the Oracle. Hamlin teaches us it doesn't matter the intent, the impact is what matters, Huddleston said.
Impact. And the impact there is being offended, or is it being marginalized?
That's implied by the rest of the context of the article, I think.
So what are we to make of this case? I mean, one thing is, I think it's a little disturbing that so much of the defense of the professor has to do with how respectful it was. One, how respectful this artwork was of Muhammad, and two, how respectful she was in showing it and what her intents were. There are plenty of educational contexts where it would be appropriate to show work that is not respectful of religious figures and is intended for that and was created for that reason.
Like
if
what?
You're teaching a class on modern satire, for example, and satirical images, which might be well taught in an art class or something, or controversies over satire, it seems to me like it would be bizarre not to include in a class like that, at least depending on what's being covered, the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, or the cartoons that sparked controversy in the Dutch newspaper from Mills Posten. There are all kinds of situations in which people view things that aren't respectful. Now, I think there's still, if you're in an educational context, there's how do you do it respectfully? You're not out to just shock and jar students. And I think it's appropriate to say, here's why we're viewing this, and here's etc. And
like,
to
how could
give
you
people
actually
warning. But
learn about anti-Semitism in the Third Reich if you didn't expose yourself to some of the Nazi propaganda, the anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda, to get a sense of what they were trying to say?
And it's part of history to read things that are bad, wrong, evil, and it's part of life that people have different views about what things are good and bad, what things are right and wrong, what things should and shouldn't be viewed. And so even if something's clearly and agreed upon by everyone in question to be wrong, there are lots of situations in which it might be appropriate to view it. And there are going to be a lot of situations in which there are things you're going to want to view precisely because there's controversy among people in the class or among people in the country or the world about whether this is appropriate, how we should judge this. So it's not as though people defending the professor are denying this point, but that so much of it is based on this was a portrayal by a Muslim and commissioned by a Muslim king and so forth. It's a little too much like that. You get the feeling of that's why it's okay, whereas in fact maybe that's why it's a surprising case that even this people objected to.
Well, part of the reason why there's the focus on intent, I think, for them is, I mean, this is from a statement that was written by one of Professor Lopez Prater's defenders, Professor Mark Bergson of the Hamlin Religion Department. Mm-hmm. And he said, notably, Islamophobia is often defined as fear, hatred, hostility, or prejudice against Muslims. The intention or motivation behind the act would seem to be essential here. And then he goes on to argue he doesn't think that she's, quote-unquote, Islamophobic because she doesn't have that intention. And so if indeed Islamophobia has something to do with intention, I can see why they would be bringing it up. But then there's a whole question of what's this concept of Islamophobia? Mm-hmm. And my biggest objection to the way that this professor has been defended is that nearly everybody has taken for granted that Islamophobia is a meaningful, well-defined, rationally defined concept, which we can decide whether she committed it or not. Mm-hmm. And if anything, I think this whole episode shows that it isn't, because, so what is it supposed to mean?
Well, let's step back a bit. One other concrete under this, responding to that, I don't think it's responding to that professor literally, but on the other side of that professor, one of the students, I recall, said that showing pictures of Muhammad is per se, just in general, always is Islamophobic, right? And that would mean regardless of the intent. And so it's not clear that that student would regard this professor's statement as true.
And that's because that student is understanding Islamophobia, I believe, through the lens of what they usually describe as systemic racism or structural racism.
Exactly how I would think.
Where it's very much a part of the conventional theory that it has nothing to do with intent, that it's all about outcome.
Right. And it's not an unintelligible or crazy theory. I think it's wrong, and it's wrong here. But you could get your head around what the idea is. If this thing is harmful to Muslim students, if they're going to be put in a bad situation by it, it's going to deny their kind of access to education because they'll be afraid to come into class. Not afraid, radically, but they won't be able to come to class without putting themselves at risk of this thing, and it's going to lead to bigotry and prejudice against. If in some way this harms them, and it's a well-known fact that this is harmful to them, and yet professors blithely, do it anyway, regardless of whether they intend that or know that or mean that, then you can say it's wrong, and it reflects a kind of insensitivity, a lack of due respect to them. And if you think about something where it would be uncontroversial that it is really damaging to a group of people and well known that it is to do something, then it seems like that's right. Like if it's well known that there's, some percentage of the population that's poisoned by a certain gas, but most people aren't. It's a genetic mutation, and you just release some in the room, knowing that to illustrate some point. It doesn't matter if you intended to kill the people in there; you're guilty of murder. Right? So there's a certain view of the kind of harms that people suffer from. That's behind this, and if you adopt that view and that's analogous here, that the idea that intent doesn't matter would then make sense.
Yeah, but back to the question of the meaning of Islamophobia. I mean, what is Islamophobia supposed to mean? The ostensible meaning is bigotry against Muslims, prejudice against Muslims, which I think
those aren't necessarily the same thing. But go.
I mean, I think there is a real thing uh, where people have irrational, unjustifiable prejudice against Muslims. The example that Ankar Ghate always gives here, which I think is really telling, is whenever you find out some members of the Sikh religion have been tarred with accusation of being they're terrorists, when they have no connection whatsoever to Islam, and so all that's functioning, the only thing that's functioning in some people's minds is this really crude stereotype of people who look a certain way and dress a certain way. I mean, that is a kind of prejudice.
And it's a prejudice. The point here isn't that it's reasonable to think that anyone who's a Muslim is a terrorist or suspect them. It's that the fact that the fact that the insinuation falls on people who aren't even Muslim tells you that what's driving people is not, oh, I know he holds these religious doctrines and I think these religious doctrines are associated with it, but just those other people who look swarthy or whatever the idea are all part of this invading monolith.
And then even when it's you people have accurately identified someone else as Muslim, it's totally relevant that there's a range of views within the Muslim world, some of which support pretty odious things and some of which don't. And you shouldn't prejudge that just because the fact someone goes to a mosque that they hold the worst views. I mean, that's itself another form of prejudice. But the way that Islamophobia is used is to take that kind of irrational bigotry and package it together with reasoned, intelligent criticism of the content of the religion, because you hear it, you hear the charge of Islamophobia levied against people who really don't have any kind of crude stereotypical prejudice, but who have, even people who are ex-Muslims, and who have all the ethnic characteristics of many others of their fellow faith, of their former faith, but who have rejected the religion, who are apostates. They're tarred as Islamophobes because they offer their reasons for why they split with the faith, why they think it's irrational, why they criticize elements of the culture. They're called Islamophobic. And now you have a case of a professor who's not even doing either of those things. Certainly not irrationally bigoted, not even criticizing. In fact, offering it up for contemplation in a positive way. And this is called Islamophobic.
Right. So now it's a third kind of thing brought in there, which is anything that's perceived to be anti the ideals or interests of those Muslims who see themselves as speaking for all Muslims.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, all of these phobia words that we have are troubling, starting with homophobic. There's a homophobic, to my mind, it kind of medicalizes and psychologizes anti-gay sentiment or anti-gay thought, which it ought to be able to refer to that in a way that's neutral as to its truth or falsity and as to its causes. Like, take anti-Semitism, right, as a phrase. The kind of etymology about, you're opposed to Semites. We don't know why somebody. It has a connotation of evil to it because people think it's wrong to be anti-Semitic. It's wrong to be anti-Semitic, but the word doesn't kind of try to spell out its origins. The phobia words suggest a kind of mental illness, phobia, and they also suggest that it's driven by fear, and I think that is the idea with homophobia. And I think it's actually plausible that a lot of what's called homophobia is driven by fear of gay people. But nevertheless, there's not it's
also not what makes it bad.
Right.
Like, someone can be afraid and suppress their fear, and they can say, I'm afraid of you, but I think my fear is baseless, and so I'm going to treat you like a human being anyway.
And maybe learn to,
Yeah.
So it's, and we've seen a kind of proliferation of phobic terms, but Islamophobic is the main one we see.
It's also somewhat ironic that it gets medicalized in that way when the whole criticism that defenders of gay rights have is of the medicalization of
homosexuality
homosexuality.
to begin with, and so it's a kind of, I mean, you can think of it as what's good for the goose is good for the gander, but I don't think it's a way of doing it. Now, in defense of a term like this, I mean, there is this kind of use of philic and phobic in chemistry, right? There are hydrophilic and hydrophobic molecules, and it just means they go towards or away from it, and nobody thinks the molecule, loves or hates water. But, the fact of phobia being primarily in people's minds as a medical diagnosis for, I think, makes it a really troubling word to get used for anti now. But so that's in general. It's a kind of psychologizing term for. But there's just a lot wrong with, in addition to the psychologizing of it, it just packages together all kinds of different ways people could have oppositional attitudes towards different things, towards a religion, towards a sect of a religion, towards a whole nationality of people, towards, being opposed to these things is not all the same as one another. And if you think of the various people who have been called Islamophobic, I think almost always unjustly, Sam Harris and so forth, of major public figures, it's not almost always unjustly, because there are cases where I think there is a kind of bigotry involved in, like the Muslim ban, which didn't make any sense national security wise.
Usually the bigotry is involved when the criticism is coming from people who have pretty ridiculous religious views of their own, but they just don't like that other religion.
Yeah. Maybe. Or just have, kind of paint with very broad. But I think the term Islamophobic is not a valid concept. It just conflates all of these very different kinds of things together, multiple good things and multiple bad things, and it's just not a tool one could use for thinking. There's also what is being pitted against. He says that the alleged offense of the professor is Islamophobia, or taking an Islamophobic action, and the defense of her is academic freedom. I don't think either of them are valid concepts.
Yeah, now what's wrong with academic freedom? Because so many people who are standing up for this professor are saying that is exactly the value that's being offended against here.
I mean, what is it?
That's a devil's advocate.
Is it supposed to be a right? Like someone gets hired by a university and therefore they have the right to say or do whatever they want? That can't possibly be the case, and nobody thinks it is. So as soon as you put it that way, you get into this, well, we have to balance it, right? You have to balance academic freedom against other things that are allegedly like it, like sensitivity, or what was the one that was balanced that it had to take the hindmost from in that statement? In this case, academic freedom has to give way to diversity, I guess it is.
Well, the rights of students.
The rights of students. So you have the rights of the faculty and the rights of students. But what is actually going on in all of these kind of cases is people are not thinking of the things that are happening as trades enough, right? And education is a trade. It's not something one has a right to. And the organizations that teach aren't things that are, dispensaries of something we're all entitled to, and that somehow have to simultaneously provide the people who teach at it freedom to say whatever they want, and then and at the same time ensure that all the students get what they're owed, the education. It's a kind of business concern. Right, it's a kind of a voluntary organization in which people want to learn and people want to teach them, and we can come up with lots of different models on how to do it. And it's widely agreed, and I think for very good reasons, that professors in higher education should have a great deal of discretion in how they conduct their classes. For one thing, they're hired because they're subject matter experts, and the people who would be supervising them one or two levels up in an organizational hierarchy wouldn't be subject matter experts on the relevant subject. And two, they're meant to be people who are experts on teaching. And again, the people one or two levels up in the hierarchy will likely not be that. And two, or three, whatever number I'm on, teaching often requires kind of creativity, thinking about new ways to bring things up, new ways to connect to students, ways to make material accessible to a changing, student body. And they're different from what they were 10 years ago, and so we want to teach differently and so forth. there's, I think, a real need in this profession, as in many others, for a lot of discretion on the part of the teachers. And so I think we should have the concept of like professorial discretion or wide ranges of discretion. But it's not freedom in any way that suggests that it's a right, because it's constrained by whatever deal the university makes, whatever policies they have, and has to be, because they're being hired to teach a particular course to particular students at a particular time in the context with an education that has certain purposes and values and so forth built into the university, and that including wants to cater to a certain clientele who you have to think about, do we want to offend this clientele? Do we want to, how do we want to approach them? What kind of stance do we want to take towards them? You can't, want to serve every customer if they have competing demands, but you have to think about who are your customers and how are we going to serve them, both as an individual professor and as the organization.
Let me ask you about that, because that's the very thing that's the very framework that some people are objecting to in the treatment of this professor. So there was a person named Alexander Jabari who wrote an article for Chronicle of Higher Education, January 12th, saying that the controversy over depictions of the prophet is routine, but the Hamlin case may be unique in that it brings a kind of Islamic anachronism, I don't know this word, together with the logic of the neoliberal university and its attempts to manage diversity. And he explains later what he means by that is the problem here is that rather than improving overall campus climate, institutions like DEI officers wind up cultivating student fragility, something they need to do in order to justify their continued existence and funding. This is a common criticism you hear from people, usually on the kind of leaning in the Marxist left direction, saying that universities, the problem with them is that they're neoliberal, they're treating students as customers who don't know what they're who don't know the subject. It's the professors who need to be in charge. They're the ones who are the proper tradesmen here. And it's a perspective that I think people on the right typically are unfamiliar with, because they kind of lump everybody on the left together. But there's this kind of old left critique of identity politics that sees it as too capitalist,
right?
In effect. I mean, do you have thoughts on that?
That has always been too much of the so-called free speech movement. And it has had the effect of distorting the concept free speech. And as soon as you do that, you think it cannot be a right. It can't be an absolute free speech. If it means that, for example, a professor should be able to say whatever he wants in a class and not get fired. If a person should be able to hold whatever views he wants and express them at work and not get fired from that job. Or even hold them privately and not express them at work and not get fired from that job. These things then become things that it's ridiculous to imagine could be absolute. Everybody is therefore forced to deal with anybody, regardless of how despicable they might find their views and opinions. And, the Jewish person will have to hire the Nazis as long as the Nazi hasn't actually killed anyone, because it would be violating the Nazis' free speech rights to not hire him because he's a Nazi. I mean, these, ideas immediately goes to reductio ad absurdum. And so the only output of that is thinking of all of these rights as things that are fungible, mutable, have to be balanced. They're not really rights. They're one consideration to put on a scale with a bunch of others. And then people just disagree about how the right to free speech balances with the right to employment and the right to diversity and the right to a safe working environment where you're not harassed or offended, or where you're interpreting as harassment and offense the preponderance of ideas that you find really disturbing in the environment. Right.
One of the worst things about the situation you just described, where you see one right balanced against all these others, which is what you get when you have unjustified claims to rights like this, is the whole concept of rights loses its meaning and function.
Right. Because
the whole reason we need a concept of rights is precisely to avoid conflicts, to avoid unavoidable conflicts with other people. A right is what says, as long as you stay within this sphere of action, you are not unjustifiably infringing on someone else's life. And the way Harry Binswanger, our mutual teachers, often put it, is rights are conflict resolving principles. And when you see all these conflicts cropping up, it's a pretty good sign that somebody's misconceptualized the issue from the
So
beginning.
rights are about what's up to whom. They're about who decides on various issues. And they are absolute, but and what they allow is people to create all kinds of different voluntary relationships in which they can tailor things to their various concrete values and preferences. So there are all kinds of trade-offs that have to be made in life, or balances that have to be struck in life, or products that have to be made to tailor to fit all kinds of different, desiderata where you have to thread a needle. But it's not a matter of balancing conflicts of rights. It's a matter of respecting all the parties' rights so that they can form agreements to do this kind of thing. So if you're, for example, trying to run an educational institution, there are all kinds of things you have to take into mind. What kind of people are there who might teach in this, and what do they want? And they might want a ton of money for doing very little work with very few constraints. On the other hand, the students might want the education for free and to all get A's to boot and so forth. And you have to think about, like, what do all the different people want? What are the different factors that enable this to happen? And therefore, what product should I create, and under what terms? How should I do it? And there are going to be a lot of different solutions to how to do that. You should expect there to be different schools with somewhat different business models, with somewhat different policies, with somewhat different curricula, with somewhat different amounts of autonomy that the professors have. Some of them might have very well codified curricula, and the instructors kind of just step you through it, and they're more or less fungible. Others might have a lot more scope and discretion for the professors, and then the classes are more different from one another. But these are just kinds of things that if we acknowledged that this was a trade, that it was a business, we could see the different room for these things, and then we could argue that certain products are better and worse, or better or worse for certain people.
And it's interesting. One of the way you were just describing, the professors want to do nothing and be paid a lot, and the students don't want to pay anything but get it for free. It's funny that contemporary institutions have figured out a way to reconcile those kinds of that supply and demand issue, and it's called the pricing system. You can't charge a price so high that nobody will pay it, but you can't charge it so low that nobody's going to be willing to supply it. And that's relevant here because probably part of the reason why people think that this is an issue of rights, and that there is a conflict of rights, is because the fact of the matter is that the way that our higher education system has been structured, not just higher education, but education generally, and even at small private liberal arts schools, is one where it's not a market system. It's not the case that the market clears because a certain price has been set by a producer. Because even in the private colleges in this country, everybody gets student aid and loans at a subsidized rate, and that vastly increases the demand
and the price
beyond the art what it would be naturally, and therefore the price,
but also and then
somebody else is paying for it usually.
And the justification for those policies is that everyone's entitled to an education, and this is a good that's being offered to people, and it therefore should be offered equally to everybody, and so as to fit every preference set, or every preference set that we regard as important enough to constitute a group that we want to protect. Because one of the things you have to think about with products is, suppose you have someone selling books. Suppose you're a guy who's operating a bookstore. You have people who want to buy your books. There are potential customers, and all kinds of questions are going to come up. Do you have pornography in the bookstore? There are people who might want to buy pornographic materials or erotic materials, whatever you want to call them, and other people who don't want to shop in a place where those materials are for sale, either because they're afraid they or their kids will run across them, or just because they disapprove of it, and they're offended. They don't want to be in the same place, and you have to decide, do I want to include those or not? And your own, values about those kinds of books, whether you think they're good or worth reading or not, will come into play in that decision. But also, like, what kind of clientele are you trying to attract, and how will it appeal to it? What about, do you carry the Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie? Some people want to read it. Some people are offended by its being there. You might be scared that some people will blow up your bookshop if it's there. But even supposing that you're not, in which case your free speech is violated if you're operating under that fear. People are threatening to force you, and you're, threatening to kill you if you do something, and you're not doing it because of that. But suppose it's just you think a lot of people won't want to shop. There's a large community of people who are offended by this book, and they would regard it as an insult to them if I carried it, and they won't come in here and buy other books. And you have to decide, do you want to carry that book or not, and why, and what's the policy going to be, and who, and those kinds of decisions, have to be made by people. In this, I want to say, like, in that case, I think the right thing to do is to carry the book, but there isn't really an answer of what's the right thing to do, independent of what are your values as the bookstore owner? What are you trying to do with this bookshop? What are you trying to accomplish? Who are you trying to reach? And likewise for a university, we have to keep in mind that there are all these kind of questions.
And what if you are running an Islamic university?
Right. There could,
and including one run by the sect that has the particular views against iconography.
And it's more than a sect. I think it's the majority of Muslims.
It is a majority. So it's not,
when sects. You say some, but also, like, suppose what your goal is in running an educational institution is to reach some community of people that you think has been underserved educationally, that you think there are lots of people in this community. Maybe it's Muslims or a certain sect of Muslims. Maybe it's whatever community it is. You think if certain ideas, thought, subjects were more widely taught to these people who aren't getting taught it, aren't having the opportunities to learn it, or aren't availing themselves of the opportunities, it would be great for the world. And you know that nobody from that community would come if you teach certain things or carry certain books. What if you are, trying to educate Amish people, for example, about things they wouldn't otherwise get educated from, and your hope maybe is that they'll stop being Amish, or they'll keep being Amish but in a different way, or whatever. Or they'll whatever your goals are for this thing, driven by your own ideology and purpose, and you think there are certain subjects that they'll come to take and study, and it will help them move in the direction you want to move them to, and others are a bridge too far.
I'll give you not to, another example of the same thing, because someone might be saying, but why would that be a valid purpose for education? Okay, I work for the Ayn Rand Institute. We have something called the Ayn Rand University. We teach classes on Ayn Rand's philosophy. We cater to a particular clientele, students and donors who are interested in Ayn Rand, who are fans of Ayn Rand, who respect her and her philosophy. That puts constraints on the sorts of material that we teach and the manner in which we teach it, and for very good reason. It's not the case that we don't welcome disagreement. We have all kinds of internal dissent and criticism and we self-criticism, but we're not going to assign people watching some like the Showtime documentary of Ayn Rand, or the biopic with Helen Mirren, because it was very disrespectful. Maybe there would be certain projects we would use it for, but it's not going to be on 101.
Yeah, so there's issues of sensibilities that you share with your students, and for that reason you would want to avoid certain material. But I'm talking about, suppose you don't. Suppose you think images of Muhammad are fine, and that it's a problem in the Muslim world that too many people reject either viewing them themselves or object to other people viewing them. And the world would be better if this taboo were changed. You might think that, and nevertheless, for some purpose, decide, nevertheless, I'm going to, have a library that loans books to people. I'm going to try to encourage this library to get adoption in a Muslim community, and I'm purposely going to avoid any depictions of Muhammad in it, because I don't think people will patronize it if there are them, and I think there are other ideas I want to get before them. So there's just, depending on what your project is, there are all kinds of different paths you might go, and the point here isn't, even if you're convinced, even if you don't share the taboo. So
you might have good reasons not to want to stigmatize people.
Yeah. And you likewise might want to have
you might also have reasons to stigmatize people in other contexts.
And you might want to push people and get them out of their comfort zone.
And this goes back to your point about why they're, you might want to show what real satire looks like in a course on satire, or study what it looks like to exercise harsh moral judgment of some other culture or something like that.
Yeah, and confront that there are real differences among us. Because if you try to shun everything that offends any sizable group of people, there are just a lot of things you won't be able to show, and it's going to be incompatible. So there are lots of people who are offended by gay couples. I know some
not as many as there used to be.
Fewer than there used to be, or interracial couples. But I know people who every time they see a commercial or something, they go, "Why is you can't turn on the TV these days and not see, every commercial has to have," and they'll go on, and they feel propagandized to by interracial couples and gay couples on television. They're defended and some of them are just a little annoyed by it, but some of them are really bothered by it, right? I think that's, an irrational attitude. I also think it's an irrational attitude to think that it's sinful to depict a certain person, whether it's Muhammad or anyone else. And there are lots of irrational attitudes, or attitudes that are arguably irrational, but that cause real offense, that lead people to be really offended by things if those people have this attitude, right? Really maybe suffer emotional distress, really feel that their kind isn't welcome here if this kind of thing is shown. And their kind could even be a kind that might belong to a protected class under current discrimination law, certain religious group, for example. Muslims with the Prophet Muhammad depictions, but, members of religious groups of any stripe who are very anti-gay, right, could feel like, well, we're not welcome here if they're depicting in a morally neutral or morally approving way gay couples or gay marriage or gay anything. You can't create an educational or other institution or environment that caters equally to the concerns of all of those people, that nobody feels unwelcome in. Right? It's not possible, because what would be welcoming to one group is precisely the thing that the other group would feel makes it unwelcoming to them. And there's a kind of fantasy that we can have it. And I think that, again, comes from this idea of the misuse of the concept rights. What the concepts of rights which is an absolute concept, allows for is people who have these different views but who all respect rights to live together peacefully. They don't kill one another or shoot one another. I might disapprove of somebody else's religion or taste in art or what kind of relationships they think they have, and they might disapprove of mine, but we recognize that it's his life to live and my life to live, and we don't have to associate. We could even shun each other for all we want, so long as we don't shoot each other, imprison each other, etc. If they don't agree to that, they don't agree to the concept of rights, but you could therefore live peaceably among people. But part of the ability to live peacefully among people who you disagree with, which is, I think, the central bright idea of the liberal tradition, what the liberal tradition makes possible in government, the tradition based on rights, that is, or it's part of it. You don't have to agree to be at peace with one another, right? So long as you respect one another's rights, as long as you agree just on that much. It allows people then to create different institutions whereby some of them are going to be strictly in adherence to a certain religious ideology, and they're only going to teach in accordance with that, and they're only going to teach things that are not offensive to people who hold that view. Others are going to do the same thing, but for a different ideology, and the other for a third ideology. And some of them, I think many of them, are going to try to make attempts to appeal to a much wider clientele that, differs on a lot of these issues. But they're going to have to find ways to do it that don't include everyone, because you can't include everyone and make everyone feel welcome.
So, in a proper system, in a proper liberal system, where everyone has the freedom to go their separate ways, you can envision, for instance, a university that gets set up where they believe in an in an exchange of ideas. They believe in challenging people's prejudices, and so they welcome people from a variety of backgrounds, a variety of creeds, and they say, in effect, look, we're going to challenge you here, but we're going to do it respectfully. So we're not going to have slurs being issued by our professors. They're going to respect the people who attend the university, regardless of their views. Now, they may sometimes do that in ways where you still find it objectionable, and you student have to be the one to decide: are you up for this challenge?
And are you willing?
And
to
if
stay?
not, that's your right. But then you'll have to just go somewhere else. And if you had a system that was truly a liberal system where people's rights were respected, that would work without anybody being able to say, but my tax dollars are going to fund this university. And whether it's a public school or a private school, because the private schools are still getting subsidized by student loans. And so don't I still have a stake in what's taught here? And how can you say I should just go somewhere else? But we don't have a system where they're free from that kind of interference with their life. And so that's what gives the sort of seed of legitimacy to the claim that there's a student's right here.
But even in a purely private context where there was a voluntary, it would still require the people running the school to take a kind of stand. And that's the kind of school I'd very much like to be a part of. I like that idea for how to run a school. But it requires to take a stand on what is offering people challenging ideas. And what is insulting them? If if the policy was, we want everyone to be able to come here. If you're going to come here, the price is you have to be willing to put up with vigorous challenges to your ideas, goring of your sacred cows, so to speak, etc. But not personal insults, not things that it's unprofessional and inappropriate conduct on our teachers' parts if they engage in slurs or this or that, right? There's always going to be cases where somebody thinks it's over the line and it isn't, and the university would have to have standards for how it would deal with those things.
An individual's own personal value hierarchies are going to have to come into the decisions. Like, I'll give you an example. I used to teach at a Catholic university. We were told at faculty orientation that at this particular university, we welcome a variety of viewpoints. We do not expect you to agree with Catholicism. We do not expect you to teach according to the Catholic line, but we do expect you to respect Catholicism. And so, like, I don't think I could have gotten away playing that Tim Minchin Pope song in one of my classes. But I decided, I don't get to play the Tim Minchin song, but I do get to teach students about Ayn Rand and atheism and all this kind of stuff and pit it up against the ideas of the Pope. And that was okay for me at the time. Now, I don't think I would do it anymore because I've moved on professionally. But that's because, again, of my own individual.
But I'll give you so I wouldn't play that song in a class or for a class or assign it. Now we're at a public university and we're referencing the song. People can look it up. It's called the Pope song. But precisely because it's so offensive. And there are songs that I think are good or bits that I think are good that make points that are relevant to some of my classes. To take Tim Minchin, he's a comedian musician who I really like. He has a song called Thank You God, which I think is a really insightful comedic critique of arguments from miracles, and actually has a lot of pedagogical value to teach because it brings up all the different ways in which all the different things you should think about when you're thinking something might be a miracle, and but couldn't it be this, or couldn't it be that, or couldn't it be the other? But it's written in very offensive language, and it's very offensive, one, to people who would be offended by some of the language regardless of their religious beliefs, and two, very disrespectful towards religion. And I don't think it would be good pedagogy to assign that in a class where I know a lot of the people do believe in God and where I'm trying to get them to think about what are the reasons for and against believing in God. On the other hand, I do regularly assign in classes where we're discussing God Julia Sweeney's monologue, Letting Go of God, which is also comedic, and she talks about the long process she went through from being a Catholic to being an atheist. And I think precisely because it's I think that it's respectful of all the different views involved. It's a kind of thing where you won't feel, I think, personally attacked and so forth by it. And these are kinds of nuanced judgment calls that are part of what someone does when they're trying to push somebody to rethink ideas. and you have to think what is a piece that's designed, is this appropriate for this audience? And the appropriateness there is not a moral judgment exactly, but like, will it make them think more about this, or will it shut them down? Will it be accessible and approachable? Is it a good next step for this person? There are lots of, questions like that you make all the time as a teacher when you're assigning things. Particularly, I think, as a philosophy professor, where you're trying to push people's boundaries and get them to consider ideas they wouldn't otherwise and rethink their attitudes. And sometimes you're purposely challenging people. But it's, there's a lot about pedagogy of thinking like how to do it, what's the right technique. That's the kind of thing that I think should fall under pedagogical discretion. But there are going to be boundaries. Like if I were a department chair and somebody was assigning the thank you God, and I think I don't know about a modern department chair, the way departments work, but I think I would talk to them about it. I wouldn't think that was something that should be assigned.
But it's important that there's pedagogical appropriateness, and pedagogy is a purpose you have if you've decided to be a professor at a certain university. But the thing that we're talking about right now is totally separate from other purposes you might have outside of pedagogy. So I'll say again, I work for the Ayn Rand Institute, and we took a pretty strong stance on the Muhammad cartoon controversy back in 2005, and then again with Charlie Hebdo in 2015. And we put up we put up posters of those cartoons, which were not respectful. They were satirical and purposefully disrespectful.
And I was at events where we showed them and moderated.
And we did it because we were there. We're not making a pedagogical exercise. It was an activist exercise there to kind of do an I am Spartacus moment, to stand up in solidarity for people whose freedom of speech and whose lives were being violated, because of terrorism.
But even there can be a pedagogical point in that too. It would just be a different point.
Yeah.
It would be like, look, here's a cartoon. Maybe you find it offensive. Maybe you think it's sacrilegious. Maybe you don't want to be in the room when it's shown. Maybe that's fine, but people are being killed over this.
Yeah.
And is this a kind of thing where that is acceptable, right? And so you'll be trying to push a different purpose. And again, depending on what you're teaching, there are different things you can do.
So let me take a step back from all of this and ask you a broader question, because we've now spent some time talking about ways in which we didn't think that the conceptual vocabulary in this controversy was adequate on both sides. You have the invalid concept of Islamophobia, on the other side, that of academic freedom. We think something bad probably happened to this professor. How do we conceptualize then what was wrong about it, and how should, if we really do think that it was a kind of injustice, how should Professor Lopez Prater's defenders have articulated themselves, do you think, in this context, in this system, which is an imperfect system?
I mean, it's made somewhat difficult by the fact that all the standards of the relevant institutions are vague, bad, crummy. But this was showing this work of art was a perfectly plausible thing to do in this class. At least by all the information we have about it, it was relevant to the material. She made every effort to be respectful of her students in the manner of showing it, knowing what kind of qualms they might have about it, or what things they might find offensive about it, which I think is an appropriate kind of thing to do. And she was fired nonetheless as a result, seemingly, as a result of students weaponizing their grievance and offense and felt victimization over it.
But is there an overarching value that we can say universities who fire people on such grounds are offending against? If it's not academic freedom, what do we call that? Do we have a single term? Do we have a phrase even?
I think there's sacrificing education in this case, and any kinds of standards that might be appropriate to enable education to an alien value. And then what is the alien value here? Well, what is the word that's used in the statement about what academic freedom must give way to here?
Here's the statement from Hamlin. they go through a few points about why academic freedom doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's subject to the dictates of society and the laws governing certain types of behavior. That academic freedom and its attendant rights does not mean anything goes. Faculty must still act professionally in their scholarly research, etc., in ways that safeguard both students and the academic integrity of the institutions and disciplines. And then I ask those who presume to judge us the following questions. First, does your defense of academic freedom infringe upon the rights of students in violation of the very principles you defend? Second, does the claim that academic freedom is sacrosanct and owes no debt to the traditions, beliefs, and views of students comprise a privileged reaction? We could have a whole other conversation about that.
But what if there was a academic freedom must be behind X or give way to X? What was the X? It was
And there's not a real single X here. It's
no, but there was another
list of
statement
things
that was given by the DEI office that had a sentence like, in this case, academic freedom must give way to.
Oh,
Because so there, the thing that's giving way is not academic freedom, but education. Insofar as it's
inclusive, well, upholding academic freedom and fostering an inclusive, respectful learning environment for our students are both required to fulfill the mission. I don't remember the giveaway statement.
I'm missing the statement, but it was something like to the students. There's a conception of what it is to be inclusive or diverse that I think is also a kind of anti-concept here.
Yeah.
And that considerations of education are being sacrificed to that. If you were taking the value the university was pursuing as education, you would think, what's educationally good? And that would include what kind of provisions what kind of scope of latitude you should give the professors in decision making, two, and then within how they execute that scope, and two, within how we judge what scope to give them, there'd be considerations about what kind of considerations of what the market wants or what the students will listen to or what will is appropriate. But here, a certain value of not offending students who represent themselves as voices of certain protected minorities is taken as a kind of commandment that can't be sinned against, right?
Coddling is one word. That's what Jonathan Haidt calls it, though I don't always agree with him.
Yeah, but it's so from one perspective you could say you're coddling the students, but another concept is saying we're sacrificing everything to avoiding this reaction to students, to not offending the students, and it's a particular small subset of students who sort of feel their oats over this kind of issue, and I think like exercising a certain kind of power.
Well, maybe it's sacrificing to the power lust of this activist student class, because the fact that the professor gave this warning well in advance, it was on the syllabus, it's at the beginning of class, the fact that she was going to this extent to be respectful, and that these students didn't opt out, does make me think that they had there's some evidence there that there was an agenda, that they wanted to use this as an opportunity to make it an example of somebody.
Also there is in the country and in the world, a certain amount of bigotry against people from cultures that are predominantly Muslim. But there is not, I don't think, in any institutions of higher learning, a willingness to trample upon what's sacred to Muslims, or to cause them offense, that's disproportionate to, that's greater than or out of scale with the similar thing for other religious groups. I mean, nobody has any qualms about offending Mormons or Catholics or any other group of people, right? There's a particular sensitivity that's, I think, been catered to around these issues with Muslim students that I think became a bigger issue after 9/11 because there were a lot of people in academia who were concerned about blowback against, since we're in a war with some Muslim countries.
That's
and with
actually interesting because the knee-jerk reaction I have to that kind of fact is to say, well, this is the way the whole intersectionality view works, that if you find the class that's the most oppressed, then they're the ones who are the ultimate victim and the kind of the holy cow. But then I also think about Ayn Rand's essay "Altruism as Appeasement," which is in which he argues that a lot of what we're asked to sacrifice for is actually people who we fear will harm us because if we show any self-esteem, and this is, I think, a case in point of that, because the same kind of deference, you don't see the same kind of deference to religious minorities who don't have, some of whose members are involved in terrorist wars.
Because you don't see it to Mormons or to Amish people.
Right. And one of the other things I wanted to talk about was it's interesting that in this case, for whatever reason, the mainstream so-called liberal media and many defenders of quote-unquote academic freedom in academia came to the defense of this professor in whatever imperfect terms. And it does seem like, as a result of that, that side stood down. The other side stood down. And we talked about how Council of American Islamic Relations national chapter said, well, maybe this wasn't Islamophobic. And that's in spite of the fact they have a history of making charges of Islamophobia against the exact same kind of thing. And I could give you examples of it. And then even Hamline University started walking back their statement a bit. And I think it's because they were afraid of this even very weak backbone that some of these institutions started to have, which they don't usually have. In this case, they started to have it because I think they saw the mob coming for one of their own. I mean, a female adjunct professor who's trying to be respectful. And it just goes to show what even a little bit of self-esteem can get you, if that's right, and why you shouldn't engage in altruism out of appeasement, out of fear for what people will do to you.
Also, insofar as people do and should have sympathy or special consideration for people who, are particularly victims or suffer particularly badly or particularly at the brunt end of injustice, the people who have it worst in the world are not, specifically with respect within the Muslim world, are not Muslims in general who are victims of prejudices against Islam or Muslims, but apostates who are victims just as much of those prejudices and also of we know people like that. And some of them then get charged on top of it with Islamophobia. I mean, think of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example, for a famous
apostates
example.
Who reject the faith, but heretics who are still still have some version of the faith, but object to elements of it and are, executed for being homosexual or any number of other examples.
Which brings us to one of the pictures behind us.
Perfect segue.
So it's worth mentioning that we're having an event on next Thursday. Yoram Brook is coming to speak, and he's talking on the way we're covering the fight for freedom in Iran, China, and the world. The title is "Because of the Yearning for an Ordinary Life," which is a line from a Farsi song that has become kind of anthem of the protest movement in Iran, and that's been an inspiration to people elsewhere. So, and it's the women in that picture who are taking off their hijab and standing up, who I have in mind, among others, when I think about the apostates or heretics or people who are the minorities within the minorities.
I think most of those women in Iran taking their hijabs off are still Muslim.
No, that's a
good bet.
All right, what time is it?
It's we've been at this for an hour and 15 minutes, so I think we should see.
We're about wrapping up. We should have said
questions.
earlier, if anybody wants to chime in, we're happy to have people chiming in. Is anybody chiming in online?
Not too many on YouTube. But those of you who are on YouTube, this is your note that you can ask questions if you like. Make comments. Did you want to say something about the other half of that poster?
Oh, and the other half is from a photograph from China of people in the protests that broke out there months ago now. They're somewhat subsiding. Started over the COVID zero policy, but one of the more interesting things that happened is that people started holding up blank pieces of paper, indicating the fact that they couldn't say anything because of censorship, and so that's part of what's depicted in that
and
picture.
Many of them would still get arrested then, even for doing that.
Yeah,
if I recall. Question? Sorry, we don't have our camera working on the questioner this time, but we have a mic.
Related to the topic directly, but UT today blocked TikTok from the campus Wi-Fi in accordance to the new state law. Do you have any comments on that?
I didn't know what happened, and I didn't know what's the relevant law that they blocked it in response to.
In December, Governor Abbott made a new law about security in the government, and all government agencies have to block TikTok.
Yeah, because it's a Chinese-owned or associated entity. I thought that they had offloaded their American subsidiary, but maybe it's only arm's length and not fully.
I think Abbott's been odd and bad on social media generally. I think security concerns about TikTok or Chinese companies seem to be more plausible concerns than the others that have been raised, but it seems odd that it would be something that would be done at the state government level rather than national government. It's like
it's the only level that he controls.
Right,
so.
But I mean, it seems like state governments oughtn't be engaged in foreign policy. But I don't know enough about it. I mean, if there really were a concrete security concern about data being stolen from the campus computers, if TikTok's installed on them or whatever, then there'd be some plausibility to it, but it seems more likely that it's grandstanding.
Yeah, I think that the most data that they're getting from our high school friends who are doing dances in their living room is different kinds of metadata on demographics, but not actual access to the content that, apart from what everybody can see already by logging onto TikTok. But yeah, I haven't heard a lot to really substantiate the
what is it claimed that TikTok can do, and is it
that's
plausible?
The question.
Like if the software was claimed to have some kind of hacking feature where it was mining data from your thing and sending it back to foreign government and so forth, then there'd be a reason to think there's a security concern about it. I don't know if that's credible or not.
So this is perhaps an example of it. Well, I don't think. Yeah, as long as the concern is security, there's some kind of proper oversight that the state government would have over the operation of the educational institution. But there's then a separate question of should government have authority over an educational institution like that?
Yeah, I mean, it does. So
it does. Given that it does, it's not really a question of ideological content being controlled.
An issue of is it a pretext, and is it if jaywalking laws are never enforced, but then somebody comes down really hard on like some guy for jaywalking and so forth, and it's clear that yes, the state has the authority to enforce jaywalking laws, but they only arrested you, and it's because you criticized the governor last night or something like that, or everyone thinks that, right? That is an abuse of power, and so the question is there some plausible reason to think that this TikTok software poses some unique threat that requires government cognizance and action, or is it, something like using a vague power arbitrarily in this one case? And that's what we'd need to know.
Well, here's a question that came up on YouTube that is relevant to some of the things we've talked about today. Any thoughts on Jordan Peterson losing his state psychological license? Is that free speech violation? I don't think he's lost it yet. I know that they were threatening to take it from him if he didn't do some kind of diversity training or something. Because
the whole having of state psychological licenses is a violation of free speech.
Yeah.
The whole existence of licensing regimes is a violation of free speech. And the reason why the whole
especially for something like psychology,
regimes, is a violation of free speech is precisely because these kinds of events will come up. So I wouldn't, in a way you could say this is a fresh and particularly egregious violation of Jordan Peterson's free speech, but it's, and one should call attention to this issue, but not like, the state licensing board was fine when they were okay with Jordan Peterson, and now just they're doing something egregious by blocking him. The empowering government bodies to make these kinds of decisions about who is fit to work as a psychologist and what opinions somebody has to have to be fit to work as a psychologist is a violation of free speech, and that's inherent in the whole idea of having the boards. Because what is it that makes someone fit to be a psychologist and someone else isn't? Presumably, it's something about what they think about what's good treatment methodologies and what aren't, and what would be appropriate and inappropriate in treatment. So the kinds of views about what opinions somebody has, exactly the kind of things such a board would have to make its decisions based on. It's making a particularly dopey decision maybe in this case, or immoral license because he's
decided to tell somebody that they are the sex that they think they are, which, regardless of what you think about that, whether it's the right kind of care or not, that's the psychologist's decision and their view, and it's the view of the patient.
And the same thing would go for, to take something that's again politically opposite, a psychologist who claims to provide conversion therapy.
Yeah.
Is it the business of the state to tell which of these kinds of manners of talking to people is appropriate and can be considered psychiatric care or psychological care? It is a business the state's put itself into. But I don't think there's a way to be in that business. There is no way to be in that business and to respect the right to free speech. That's not something a state can or should do. And then we could consider certain cases of it particularly egregious, but which you consider egregious are going to depend on what kind of speech you think is right and wrong. In part, at least.
Anyone else like to ask any questions, or should we start to wrap things up?
I think we should wrap things up. So thanks, everyone, for coming.
Why don't you remind people about that again?
Remember, we're having this talk about Yaron Brook on the
26th. That's next Thursday.
A week from Thursday. We're going to have another session of this podcast next Thursday. I think we're going to talk about what is freedom on that one.
I think that's the plan, to get ready for this conversation.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's it for tonight.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. We have a slightly larger audience in the room tonight than usual, and maybe that's something if you are watching, listening, and you're in the Austin area, you can come on down to UT and watch us do this live and ask questions from the audience, and we're hoping to get more and more people coming, so please consider that.